Have the risks and challenges changed following the financial sector crisis of a couple of years ago? What have you been discussing over the past couple of days?
Absolutely, Stephen. I think that there are some very significant learnings from the global financial crisis, and they have really provided the focus for our conference here today, or over the last few days. And one of them is, of course, that systemic risk, which used to be considered the provenance of banks and bankers and bank regulators, that systemic risks can occur in the markets and can be transmitted in the markets, and that learning has meant that IOSCO has had to focus much more on systemic risk in markets, and that's been a major focus of our conference here over the last few days. The second great learning, I guess, won't be a revelation to the people of South Africa, but it is the shifting centre of gravity, economic gravity globally, as we see the move of economic power from west to east and north to south. And that was why it was such a perfect place to be discussing these major change issues here in South Africa, in beautiful Cape Town.
Yeah, of course, and beautiful weather as well down in Cape Town. Up in Johannesburg, very rainy and miserable, Jane, so probably reminiscent of New Zealand at this stage.
Now, just like Wellington, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and IOSCO, 119 members, so 119 jurisdictions. How do you get them to work together so you can root out the systemic risk in the system?
Well, Stephen, I think IOSCO is a unique organisation. It is clearly a multilateral global organisation. And where a lot of other multilateral global initiatives have stalled or paused or failed, IOSCO has managed to power on to create relevant principles which are now very operational. We've moved from having aspirational principles to now to very operational ones. That is, principles which are required to be implemented all over the world. The G20, for example, has insisted that IOSCO principles be implemented fully in every G20 country, and has encouraged all other countries to implement the IOSCO principles fully. So this is going to bring about an equivalence of securities markets regulation globally, and I think that's an extraordinary achievement, and one which really many people might have thought were impossible, say even 10 years ago, but the journey over the last 10 years has been one of really quite some success.
How do you implement and enforce such regulations, though, across so many jurisdictions? Do you need to have the buy-in of all members of IOSCO?
Indeed. That's certainly, all of the principles are set by consensus. So there's no voting, it's not, there's no way that one jurisdiction can push another jurisdiction. But it's my personal belief that policymakers and others understand that the implementation, the full implementation of the IOSCO principles is a badge of good global corporate citizenship, and that people involved in capital formation and looking for capital, places to put their capital, are interested in whether jurisdictions are actually compliant with the IOSCO principles. And that in itself, I believe, is a driver to policymakers and others. For example, we have an exchange of information memorandum which countries can only sign on to if they've been very rigorously audited to see that their legislative framework and their capability is that they can hand on enforcement information. And we set a deadline of 2010 for all countries to have agreed to sign on to this. Now, for some jurisdictions, it was a big ask. They had banking secrecy, they had rules that would put some barriers into the seamless exchange of information. But by the 1st of January 2010, all countries, just except a very few who at the time had no government or had some very significant difficulties, had signed on or had agreed that by 2013, it's our new deadline, that they will have completely signed on to this memorandum. Now, that is extraordinary progress, and I believe that jurisdictions see that it's in their own interests to be congruent with the IOSCO principles. And of course, now with the G20 mandating it takes on a different complexion. And IOSCO sits on the Financial Stability Board. We have 2 seats on the Financial Stability Board, and recently we were invited to a G20 meeting to talk about our work in commodities trading. So we are very much an integral part of the global financial architecture.
Jane, to what extent has regulation prevented worse fallouts from the financial sector crisis, and which areas have you identified over the past couple of days that could do with some more strengthening?
Well, I think the whole area of systemic risk in markets does need to be tangibly fleshed out, and certainly there's been a lot of work being done recently, and we had a very interesting presentation yesterday by a group of experts on the tools that can be used by regulators to identify systemic risk in markets and to address it. And we passed 2 new principles on systemic risk in markets in Montreal last year. One which requires regulators to look over the perimeter of current regulation and ask yourself what is happening in those dark parts of the market that aren't currently regulated. And the second principle requires regulators to have a research capacity so that you can map what's happening in your markets and share that information with other markets, because as we know, these markets are completely global, that money moves around at the click of a mouse, and discontinuities or problems in one market can radically affect institutions and other markets, and that's what we saw in the global financial crisis, of course.
Well, you mentioned, of course, the shift of power from the West towards the East, and we do have globalization of markets at this stage. So how about cross-border surveillance? That must be something you have to get your thumb on top of at the same time.
Absolutely, and that is a major work stream and of the Technical Committee of IOSCO. And that is going to be very interesting developments are happening in that space, both regionally and globally. And yes, there's a lot of work being done exactly on that particular topic.